I often get questions if I could point you to further resources which I have found useful and you could also use and study. Welcome back, my name is Stephen Hollander, and in this video I will go through a quick review of GAN Made Easy, written by William McLaren. I will walk you through things I've never mentioned before, like the so-called horizontal angles, and I will also highlight some traps which you should avoid during your journey. When it comes to GAN research, I already referenced the pain point, and I explained that we need to focus on what is effective and don't just fall for the impressive, difficult or mysterious stuff that has very little practical use. I think this book does a great job when it comes to that. The good side is that it picks up the well-known terms, which I call the GAN jargon, and explains them very simply. I will talk about those in the video. But the bad side of the book is still typical when it comes to GAN research. Same as others, the author uses traditional references to justify his own interpretations. I don't plan to talk about those issues extensively in this video. I have already mentioned some of them in my past videos, about the quote "nothing new under the sun" and, obviously, in the one about the number 9. These are impressive subjects, but again, here I want to give you something that you can put into practice, or at least you can take some ideas away for yourselves and experiment with them. So, let's see the book. I'm not going through the whole contents of the book because there is no need. It would take us too far away from the subject of chart analysis. First, I will show you the introduction in a condensed form because I agree with the author on a lot of things which he summarized there. Then I will quote page 17 because it gives us an important insight about the good and bad side of this book. We will spend the most time going through the most extensive chapter, the cycle of years. Along the way I will highlight the important topics. We will even return to the questions around the scale. Finally, I will give away something which is the best kept secret when it comes to cycles. The funny thing is that it won't come as a surprise because I already gave it away in my past videos. I just didn't make a big enough hype about it, so here it is now. I hope you will find this review interesting and useful.
Many claim to have found the cornerstone of all of the predictive work which Mr. GAN accomplished. But none works accurately and well all of the time. If your reason is to find that one secret, you will be disappointed. The purpose of this book is to give you a grasp of the charting techniques and knowledge of time. I have discovered simple techniques. My premise was, find out what works, when to apply it, and then use it. I hope you will use the simple methods in your work. The information which comes from the techniques is only useful when one has the knowledge of how and when they work. Keep it simple. Why these techniques work, I will not attempt to fully explain. I have found that GAN wrote in the manner of the ancient mystics. The truth is given, and you have to draw the conclusion. He was speaking in syllogisms, he did not give you the conclusion. Very important. The foundation to successful trading is knowledge of price movement.
I chose this page for a quick walkthrough of what's coming because I think it represents the whole contents of the book, how it is built up. Just stop the video and read the whole page. It's very confusing, isn't it? I think this is the biggest issue with GAN literature in general. We all agree with the opening sentence, overbalance of time and price. Basically, this is what angles do. They measure this so-called balance of price over time or the other way around. But then we get all sorts of things. He mentions ranges and describes something that could be called a breakout trade. I won't show you the illustrations because random examples won't say much. Then we deep dive into the mysterious world of squares without any explanations other than how important such and such numbers and 50% levels are. He seems to disregard what he said in the introduction about simplicity. If you take notes, by the end of the book you'll have all sorts of numbers written down as important, every single one of them. And the biggest inconsistency is when he talks about squares of numbers. Later on we'll see that he explicitly mentions geometrical squares which are not numbers multiplied by themselves. Then here we are, the so-called horizontal angles. I will also return to these later, but at least he gives us a definition here. Price movements up or down from a bottom or a top into proportionate resistance or support levels. Very interesting. We'll also return to those time movements later. So let's have a closer look at these topics. Now let's get to what we can consider the main part of the book. I put this whole page here for you to see the whole context. Again, I can only agree with him about his remarks on using computers. Obviously the situation has improved a lot since the 80s when the book was written. Now we also have to make sure we use correct data for our analyses because we have plenty of data streams to choose from. But I know these sentences have already caught your eyes.
It is widely known that Mr. Gen used a considerable amount of reference to planetary movement in his forecasts, and that his cycles were based upon these observable phenomena. I have found very little of his work would fall into the category of astrology. The basic calculations or vibrations are based upon geometry, of which planetary movement and distances are one and the same. A large number of things can be said for astrology, both positive and negative. It is not my purpose to give such a discussion, although I am of the opinion that the classic form of astrology has little validity in trading the markets.
Please realize how he makes a very important distinction. What he points out here is that Gan incorporated numbers from astrology or astronomy. In other words, the effort he made was how to quantify those planetary movements. Let me digress a little bit here because in fact there is a very interesting philosophical problem when it comes to breaking down any kind of movement. I think I'll need to return to this in the future. Here and now we only deal with practical problems. I mention this only because, as you can see, unfortunately then the author again reverts from this line of thought and confuses symbolic numbers with what he calls observable phenomena. What do I mean? There is a difference between modern scientific methods and ancient teachings. Today we try to base everything on so-called observable phenomena and build up theories around data which we pull from those. But in ancient times they were aware that observations were always imperfect. Why? Because only God knows everything. But it really doesn't matter whether you use the traditional thinking or the modern approach, because in our case the result is the same. Calculations about our so-called observable or physical reality are always imperfect in some sense, because it is impossible to quantify every single factor in reality, so the numbers will always be approximate. As I've said, this is more of a philosophical problem, not a mathematical one. It's not the case that you are not exact enough with your numbers and you make mistakes. So when I say that the author confuses these two, symbolic numbers in ancient texts and exact numbers observed by scientific means regarding planetary movements, then on top of this confusion he brings up traditional texts to justify his own interpretations, like the prophet Ezekiel from the Bible, with his so-called wheel within a wheel. Well, I think I've already said this is just not a legitimate way. Unfortunately, it is a recurring theme throughout the book. But I don't want to digress too much. Let's return to actual and practical applications. People often put too much stress on the subject of scaling. I don't want to get into too much detail here because I already made a short lesson on scaling. You can find a link in the description. What McLaren describes here again just proves that the scale was changed because they had a limited surface to work on and they had to utilize it the best possible way. So he was still thinking in terms of a handmade chart, as you will see. Here he talks about the fact that you will need to be able to follow the price movement with your analyses. But you don't have to believe me, just grab a piece of paper and experiment. What I want to show you here though is the problem as he had to approach it, as I said, on paper, while we do it in a more flexible way. The point is that in case of lower prices, the one-to-one angle becomes almost vertical in relation to price movement, so it might not be of any use. And because I don't want to take these paragraphs out of his context, still on page 42 he mentions this. The question is, if this was so critical, what was the point of leaving the explanation till nearly the end of the book? On page 196 we find this. So basically all he does, and excuse me the pun, he just reinvents the wheel. Obviously, this won't change the fact that the 1-to-1 angle is still 1 point up or 1 point down, not fractions of points. And when it comes to horizontal angles, he just proportionately breaks them down into smaller increments the same way. But to fully understand this, instead of complicating it, let's carry on reading. Unfortunately, the book was not edited by anybody. The text gives me the impression of an incomplete manuscript. So before you start experimenting with angles, let's have a look at a very important definition. There are some very important definitions on this page. I have no idea why he doesn't give us these at the very beginning instead of obscure references to cycles and the scriptures. But as I've just said, this book is not very well edited into a text altogether. Let's see those definitions.
One idea that I am certain has caused a good deal of confusion among individuals who are early in their study of Gan's work is the idea of squares. Gan referred to cycles as squares, and the squares which he used were geometric squares, that is, just a plain square drawn on a chart with 4 equal sides. This is not a number multiplied by itself. The squares which Gan used are all based off of price movement. A fully constructed square is a very complicated piece of artwork, which consists of the square itself, and all of the angles which Gan used radiating from the top and bottom left-hand corners. Following this, the division in time are marked with vertical lines, and in price, the divisions are marked with horizontal lines. Remember, Gan referred to these also as angles. Gan used these squares for timing and to find horizontal divisions in price, at which to expect support and resistance. He said that you could look for change on every one of the divisions in price and time. But, if you do that, you are spending a considerable amount of time. Other than midpoints, I have never had any confidence in the divisions, alone, as a tradable setup.
So the first thing, squares are cycles. This is so important it's shocking he doesn't even mention it again. And second, here we go. These squares are not numbers multiplied by themselves, despite how he used the same word earlier within the book. And third, these squares, or cycles, are related to price movement. Seems obvious, for now let's just keep this in mind. Fourth, you have the so-called horizontal angles which do nothing else but break down, again, the price movement, up or down, into increments or divisions as he calls them. In other words, they are used for support and resistance. And finally, he mentions the divisions in time by vertical lines. I already have a video about that topic, basically the same thing as the cycle tool in charting programs. I made that video because everybody seems to be so obsessed with this idea and thinks this is how you analyze cycles and it takes nothing else. Why I think it's an incomplete idea first of all comes down to the fact which I have mentioned about cyclical numbers being approximate, and second, in practice by using this tool or idea alone, you won't be able to tell if you have a top or a bottom, a sell or a buy signal. Only angles can show you that. I agree with McLaren when he mentions this. There is so much valuable information in this one paragraph alone that you'll need to go through these step by step on a piece of paper. You will not understand it otherwise. A 45-degree angle is drawn down from the high, and a 45-degree angle is drawn up from 0. For the square of the high, where they intersect is 50% price and time. The 2 times 1 angle from the high will give you a fourth of the square in time when it crossed the 50% mark in price, and half the square when it hits 0. The 1 times 2 angle will give you the square of the second square when it hits 0. I hope you can still follow. Have you noticed that all of a sudden he talks about a 45-degree angle, not a 1-to-1 or a 1 times 1 as he calls them? Why 45 degrees? If you remember my previous videos, I said it had taken me a long time to realize that these two, the 45-degree and the 1-to-1 angles, are not the same. Also remember that I've just shown you what McLaren did with charts in low price ranges. He says he changes the price scale to 0.125,000th. And I say you need to be careful because angles will become almost vertical in relation to price movement in lower price ranges. Let me remind you again of my video on scaling. Are we talking about two different things here or the same thing from two different viewpoints? As I demonstrate to you in that video about the basics of charting, this is a very simple technical difference between the hand-drawn chart and the computer-generated chart. Paper-based charts are static, computer-based charts are flexible, dynamic. So he made an effort to stick to a 45-degree angle, but that angle was not a one-to-one angle necessarily. A one-to-one angle is 1 point up or 1 point down on every increment. Let's return to that quote again. So let's just do the maths again as it would be done on paper. 0.125 equals to 1/8. Which can also be transcribed as 1/8. He was only reinventing the wheel. On a static chart, this makes the 1/8 angle look like 45 degrees. I'll let that sink in. This is the reason why I prefer using and saying 1:1 instead of 1 times 1. All this really brings me to the conclusion. So far I could hopefully show how this book can help you think systematically, based on a structure. The rest of the chapters look interesting, but they're not all that useful, unfortunately. Why? From page 49, McLaren cites a large amount of original GAN material and inserts his own notes, but it's not really obvious. I want to remind you of this graphic again. Let me show you why. Remember what I've said. If you take a note of all the so-called important numbers, you will have a never-ending list. And also you should already know from my video about the number 9 that these ones are all related to 9, which means they are symbolical numbers. Now also remember what I have just explained about the so-called observable reality. These were never meant to be precise as we understand precision. For instance, you expect to trade the number 90. But the market bottoms out 1 or 2 days later than you expected and you're out of business. If you want to find tops and bottoms, only angles can show you, because when you're calculating angles, you're already analyzing cycles. And this brings me to the secrets I have promised you before I wrap up this video. I don't just give you 1, I will give you 3, because you have managed to listen through this exceptionally long video. I have already talked about the first one, so I will just leave it here as a reminder. Squares are cycles. The second, once you understand what squares mean on the chart, you can re-evaluate this well-known quote. You remember I've said that references to the Bible are brought in illegitimately. The same applies to these popular scientific concepts of the fourth dimension or space-time. So just ignore all these and focus on what's written down. You've already understood a lot about squares and circles, but where is that triangle? Here. By analyzing angles, you're calculating cycles. The third, or probably the only real secret. So far we have managed to put some of these concepts from here to here. But for these to be of any use in trading, you don't just need to build a structure, you also need consistency. This is what differentiates the experts from the simple fans of these methods. Simply speaking, you know what to use and why. Because what do most people do when they analyze angles? They place these all over the charts. Why? Because that is all they see on GAN's original charts, forgetting that those were drawn by hand over the complete course of developing a chart. We don't necessarily do this on a computer, but GAN had no computers. When you place random angles on the chart, you will get random results. How do you avoid that? This is where the third secret comes into play, and you already have a clue about it. McLaren talks about the square of high, low and the range. This is a hint. The issue when it comes to cycles of time is that the points of references are completely useless if you misplace the origin. Think about that. The rest of the coordinates will be out of place as well. I wouldn't even use these designations, the square of high, low and range, because these are misleading for a number of reasons, just the same way as most of the GAN jargon is misleading. But all of that will be the subject of further videos because I have given you plentiful to digest for now or for the next 5 years. I hope you will use these explanations to correct your methods, take something away and experiment. Thank you for watching.